Good afternoon, and welcome to today's AFTD Healthcare Professional webinar at the intersection of FTD and the law. I am Will Reiter, and I am the Education Program Manager at AFTD, the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. Thank you for joining us today. We are pleased to present today's program, focusing on a very difficult issue, which can be very distressing to families and challenging for healthcare professionals. We will get to the webinar presentation shortly. Just a few quick announcements. First, you should know that all of the attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. AFTD staff are working behind the scenes and are happy to help you if you are encountering a technical issue. Let us know directly by writing a message in the Q&A box. Second, time permitting, we will conduct a brief question and answer session at the end of the webinar. Use the same Q&A box to submit your question, and you do not need to wait till the end of the presentation to do that. Also, the webinar will be recorded and archived for later viewing on AFTD's YouTube page and in the webinars section on our healthcare professional page on our website. Next slide. We want you all to be aware that AFTD is bringing our annual education conference to the Denver, Colorado area in May. You can learn more about this two-day event by clicking on the link at the bottom of this page, visiting that URL. And you should know that our full-day conference on Friday, May 2nd is available both in person and online via a live stream, but also several aspects of the conference will only be available to in-person attendees, including a special symposium on FTD genetics, which takes place on the afternoon of Thursday, May 1st. We encourage you, whether you're a healthcare professional or a family member living with FTD, to check out the conference and also share it with your networks. We hope you can all join us. Next slide. This is a screenshot of AFTD's healthcare professional webpage, and on it you can access a number of important resources for a healthcare professional in relation to information about the FTD disorders, resources you can share with your families. It includes a library of our healthcare professional webinars and a listing of our healthcare professional e-publication, Partners in FTD Care, which details best practices and other information in support of your work with families. New issues come out every other month of that e-newsletter, and you can subscribe to that newsletter or get regular information about our CME CEC webinars by clicking on the Join Our List for Healthcare Professionals Mail List tab. For healthcare professionals watching the live webinar today, you are able to get 1 hour of CME or CEC credit, and that is possible through our relationship with Rush University's Center for Innovative and Lifelong Learning. You will receive an email from us tomorrow with that submission information and link. You have 10 days from the date of the webinar to complete the Center for Innovative and Lifelong Learning evaluation and claim credit. Once you've filled out the evaluation, you can generate your certificate immediately. This is a list of the learning objectives, and I believe that our speaker today will also go over those in his presentation. So we will move on. Finally, we just want to acknowledge that this is a very challenging and difficult topic. Incidents involving law enforcement and criminal behavior, unfortunately, can occur with some individuals with a dementia. For those living with FTD, and particular those with a bvFTD diagnosis, these incidents can be very distressing to families and challenging for healthcare professionals to provide education, support, and information. We want to acknowledge upfront that the antisocial behaviors common to bvFTD in particular do not always lead to criminal behaviors, but can for some individuals. Our speaker will present an in-depth look at the issue to highlight the prevalence and type of behaviors. Our hope is that by approaching this topic based on current research, we can bring greater clarity and understanding and shed more light on the underlying causes. For any of you listening today, whether a healthcare professional or a person living with FTD, we certainly encourage you to contact our helpline listed at the bottom of this slide. If you have any further questions or concerns, please reach out to us. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker to you today. Dr. Ryan Darby is Chief of the Division of Behavioral and Cognitive Neurology, Director of the Frontotemporal Dementia Clinic, and Assistant Professor of Neurology at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. He received his undergraduate degree from Princeton in psychology and neuroscience, and his medical degree from Vanderbilt, with further training in neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham and Women's as part of the Harvard Neurology Residency Program. Dr. Darby is especially interested in patients with symptoms at the border zone between neurology and psychiatry, and he has received numerous awards for his research. Dr. Darby, welcome to our virtual podium.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear me?
You are loud and clear.
Right. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone about this topic, something that I've been interested in, that has been important for the patients that I've seen, and hope to talk to you a little bit more about FTD and the legal issues that can come up in our patients. And so the objectives of the talk today, the first is really to recognize the incidence of law enforcement interactions with patients with FTD as compared to other dementias. So just to highlight that these behaviors are occurring and the types of behaviors. And then to list the types of symptoms that our bvFTD patients may have that could lead to the response from law enforcement and legal issues. And then finally, at the end, I hope to talk a little bit about recognizing the issues around the forensic or legal issues that come up. So questions of criminal responsibility, diminished capacity, and competency that may be important for patients with FTD who are involved in the judicial system. And so just to start off, I want to talk a little bit about a case example. This is a case that had been published in the media about a 48-year-old former school librarian who developed really profound behavioral changes. He initially was fired from his job for making sexual advances towards students, a behavior that was very atypical and unexpected by those who know him. He was then convicted of bank fraud twice, and in that result, losing a majority of his family's assets. And his wife struggled to obtain control of his finances because during some of his initial evaluations, he had some cognitive screening tests and seemed to perform normally. So that was denied. And because of these ongoing behavioral issues, both the stress interpersonally and because of the legal issues that resulted, ultimately filed for divorce. After bouts in prison, he was released to a homeless shelter, but unfortunately, there was an incident there that ended up in him being killed. And his family, recognizing that something had changed in him, ultimately got an autopsy and he was found to have FTD pathology. So I think the question that comes up is, could we have prevented this? could we have identified this earlier? And was there another route that could have happened that would have prevented these issues from coming up? And so to take a quick step backwards, just to give everyone a background on the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia, which is what we'll predominantly be focusing on, this is a type of early onset dementia that, rather than affecting memory, as might be the case in Alzheimer's disease, really manifests at its core with changes to our social behavior, emotions, and personality. And so the core clinical features that we look for when we're evaluating patients with frontotemporal dementia, um, first and foremost, the thing we think of is socially inappropriate behaviors. And so this may be not recognizing the norms of how we normally would behave in a context, not being able to control our behavior in these social contexts. And that can lead to awkward encounters, including criminal behavior in some of the more extreme cases. Now, there are other core features that we look for when we're thinking about the diagnosis of bvFTD. Another aspect is the emotional part, so that loss or lack of sympathy, of empathy, compassion, the warmth that we normally had towards our friends and family can be affected, and that can cause a lot of interpersonal issues, as well as potentially contributing to some of the behavioral and antisocial behaviors that we see. Patients also struggle with motivation and can have apathy, with less interest, less motivation to do things that, in extreme examples, can lead to problems with hygiene, of bathing, many other aspects of just our bodily care. There are stereotyped or repetitive movements, and this can extend onto obsessive thoughts and fixations around routine and rigidity around that. There are hyperorality or dietary changes, the most common being an increased interest in pursuing sweet foods. And then executive function problems, where patients are having more challenges with reasoning through, making decisions, following multi-steps, and figuring out how to do things that can lead to problems at work, but also in other social situations as well. And so when we are evaluating a patient for possible behavioral variant FTD, we look to see, do they have 3 of these 6 clinical core features that aren't explained by another type of disease or disorder. And we often will get brain imaging in these patients, because if we can identify that there are changes to the frontal and temporal lobe, either volume changes on brain MRI, functional changes on FDG PET, that increases our confidence that this really is bvFTD is the cause of these symptoms. And then in a small number of cases, about 10% of patients, they can have an identified autosomal dominant mutation where we can more definitively say this is FTD. For the vast majority of other patients, however, we have to wait until autopsy to get that definitive diagnosis. And because of the more atypical features of this dementia compared to others, and that lack of the definitive criteria, FTD is often misdiagnosed. So we often see patients where the diagnosis is delayed, or that another diagnosis has been proposed beforehand. And so for the behavioral symptoms, that can often be misdiagnosed or misattributed to a psychiatric disease. Whenever we see someone who has a later onset of bipolar disorder, for instance, FTD might be one of the things that we should think of as a cause for that. And then some of the other types of FTLD symptoms more broadly, the motor symptoms that we can see in many patients may be misdiagnosed or lead to the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease because of the similarity. And similarly, the cognitive issues may be described as memory when really they're more executive function or other issues with behavior, and get misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. So that can lead to delays in the diagnosis and the accurate characterization of what's really going on. Now, the focus of the talk today, and what I hope to hone in on, is criminal behavior in bvFTD. And it's estimated that this, is not a rare occurrence. This can happen in 37 to 57% of our patients with FTD. And that may even be the reason for presentation. So the initial reason for seeking help or evaluation in about 14% of cases. And so this goes along with the changes to social behavior and emotional function that we see. The challenges are that in many instances, the patients who have committed a crime or an antisocial behavior, they may be able to describe that there are negative consequences to this in theory, and that there is wrongfulness or that it's illegal to do some of these behaviors. but they also often seem less concerned, or that like they don't fully appreciate the wrongfulness of that. And despite the prevalence, the disability, the challenges that come up, particularly with these types of behaviors in bvFTD, we still have an incomplete knowledge of really what the mechanisms are that are leading to these behaviors, and little or less effort has gone into understanding, treating, preventing these symptoms. So I think it's an area where, as we move forward, we can really hope to make a benefit to patients and their families by delving into this a little more deeply. And so to get a broad sense of the rates of criminal behavior in dementia, a few years ago, we had looked at the literature about existing studies, and saw that patients with bvFTD have an increased incidence of criminal behavior compared to other types of dementias. And we can see that across these different studies, that was about 40% of patients that may have had these behaviors, compared to only 7% in Alzheimer's disease. There are other types of FTD besides the behavioral variant. I'll focus more on the behavioral variant today. But in the semantic variant, for instance, there was also a high incidence of 27% of patients with that type of clinical syndrome that had criminal behavior. And so it's something that within the FTLD spectrum, is occurring in our patients, to various degrees. So we, to explore this further, had developed a questionnaire really trying to prospectively characterize what these antisocial or criminal behaviors are. And we cast a pretty wide net. We came up with 26 different types of behaviors. And these were taken from prior reports in the literature, from our own experience in clinic, and from some reports in other types of patient populations, or populations where criminal behavior and antisocial behavior may be more prevalent. And we administered the questionnaire to a group of our bvFTD patients, as well as patients with Alzheimer's disease or other types of FTLD syndromes. And we saw that there was really a wide range of different types of behaviors that our patients and the families of these patients had reported. And so just to hone in on a few of those areas, so one was physically threatening, or even physically harming a person. That was more rare. That was only about 17% of cases, but still about a third of our cases, patients had physically threatened another individual, which was elevated compared to the other diseases that we looked at. And so some of these aggressive type behaviors. There were also a group of behaviors affecting sexual behavior and what's appropriate. And that ranged from inappropriate sexual language that happened in about half of our bvFTD patients. There were more significant issues related to inappropriately touching or hugging or kissing others in a way that was felt to violate social boundaries and social norms that happened in about 20%. And perhaps even more problematic in some instances of exposing oneself, which can lead to serious issues when that's done in the wrong context. And so these behaviors were also very common in our patients with bvFTD. There were property violations, so violations of stealing or of using property without permission that happened in about a quarter of our patients. So again, leading to other types of potential legal issues that may come up. And there were traffic violations in about a quarter of our patients. So again, was elevated compared to the other patient groups that we looked at. And in some of our patients with behavioral variant FTD, this can escalate more because of some of the issues around disrespectful behavior, not understanding the context of talking with police officers, or of demonstrating other changes to behavior that may lead to questions of substance use in the context of when they're pulled over. So some of these traffic violations may lead or escalate in a way that they may not in other diseases. One thing that we found as we were looking at the different types of behaviors is that they actually seem to cluster when we did a factor analysis into two factors that were maybe finding different types of behaviors. One seemed to be capturing more of the aggressive behaviors, so whether that was verbal, emotional, or physical aggression. and another group of behaviors that was capturing more rule breaking, or things that weren't causing necessarily a direct physical harm, but were nevertheless violating social norms or rules around behavior. And this actually fits with some prior work in other populations showing that these two different types of antisocial behaviors may have different mechanisms leading to them. And so they seem to have different genetic risk factors associated with the two. There are different developmental trajectories for where in development these behaviors tend to become more prominent. And there are differences in the associated neurocognitive issues that may be going on, and some of the neuroimaging associations that have been found that may suggest that these are different types of behaviors that we may want to treat slightly differently when we're thinking about prognosis or about preventing and treating these symptoms. And so that leads in to questions about what is it that could be driving these antisocial or criminal behaviors in our patients with bvFTD. And a starting point for looking at this might be to look at criminal behavior that emerges in other patient populations with damage to the frontal and temporal lobes, and particularly patients with focal brain lesions. And so these are patients that may have had a stroke or a tumor or a type of traumatic brain injury that led to a behavioral change. And so many of these, or some of these patients have been reported to develop antisocial and criminal behavior as a result of those injuries. And so in an earlier study, we tried to look at this and identify patients where it seemed that there was a focal brain injury to a specific part of the brain. And we identified cases that we thought had a fairly high probability association. So these were cases that seemed like there was a good track record of normal behavior, an onset of a focal brain lesion in the frontal and temporal lobes, and subsequent development of antisocial behavior, including criminal behavior afterwards. We also identified 23 cases where there was maybe a less clear association, but there was still a strong suspicion that the lesions were resulting in the behavioral change. And our hope was that by doing this, we could identify the overlap of the brain region that was common across all these cases that would, potentially tell us this is the brain region that seems to be important for regulating behavior or leading to criminal behavior when damaged. But when we actually looked at those lesions, we saw that there were many different parts of the brain. And so here we traced the brain lesions onto a standard map of the brain, and the lesions themselves are in red so that we could compare across different patients. And we saw that it was many different parts of the brain. So we saw parts of the frontal lobe, but that included the right side, the left side. There were lesions in the ventral or the lower part, as well as the higher dorsal areas, some that were in the middle, some that were more lateral. And many of the lesions fell outside of the frontal lobes. And so we saw different parts of the temporal lobe, the anterior temporal lobe, medial parts, including the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens. And so across these lesions, we couldn't say that there was this is the one area that when damaged is going to lead to this type of behavior. And so as we were looking at this question, I had the fortunate opportunity to be working with two really brilliant neurologists, Michael Fox and Aaron Boas. We're in the process of developing a method to try and localize types of behaviors like criminal behavior using a different approach. And it's really testing the idea that the reason why a brain injury or an effect in the brain may lead to a certain behavior, it may be because of the effect of that location on the rest of the brain. And that if we use a wiring diagram of the brain, so where different parts of the brain are connected to what we refer to as the human connectome, we could test a different hypothesis, which is that even if each of these brain injuries was happening in a different part of the brain, they may all be part of the same network. They may all be connected to the same network of regions, and that it's really the function of those interactions between those brain areas that's important for these behaviors emerging. And so I'll try not to get too technical, but the basic approach, as you can see here on the left, is that there are in red the tracings of 3 brain injuries that led to criminal behavior in 3 different patients. And then in the middle, we see the locations where that brain lesion is connected to. And at the very far right, we can add those all up and say, are there any parts of the brain where it seems like there's a consistent pattern where all or most of those brain lesions causing criminal behavior might be connected to? So is there a common network for this? And what we found is that there was, so that in all of our patients, even though the brain lesions themselves were happening in different parts of the brain, all of them showed a common pattern of connectivity to the orbital frontal lobes, to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, to the amygdala and nucleus accumbens, so a network of connected areas involved in these functions. And we saw that as well in our replication cohort, so it seemed consistent. And then on the bottom, we showed that it was specific. So we compared the connectivity pattern of lesions causing criminal behavior with those causing other types of behaviors, but not criminal behavior. And we saw that it was only brain lesions causing criminal behavior that really showed this pattern on the brain MRI. And so it seemed to suggest that what was common across all of these brain lesions that resulted in this behavior was that they were in locations connected to these brain regions. And so as we go back to the potential legal implications, one question that comes up with patients where it's a question of if they have a neurological disease contributing to their behavior is it predictive? So can we say that this lesion is going to lead to criminal behavior? And I think in this case, when we're asking whether it's possible a brain disease or an injury to a certain part of the brain is contributing, I think this gets closer towards telling us that these are the brain regions where we might expect that this could occur. And so I think it can help to support that type of analysis. But I think that the flip side of that, of saying that damage to this area will always lead to criminal behaviors or criminal actions, I think that's not the case. And I think that's important to consider not only with these patients with focal brain lesions, but also with our patients with FTD or other types of FTLD syndromes, is that not every patient is going to have significant antisocial behaviors or crimes. And so there are other factors that contribute to that. And that gives us potential places to say these are what areas we want to focus on in terms of trying to prevent or treat those behaviors. So the next question that comes up in terms of the mechanism, so what's leading from these diseases, the brain's affecting the frontal and temporal lobes to the actual behaviors themselves, is how does that affect the cognitive processes that might be important for preventing criminal behavior or antisocial behavior? And so to look at that, we looked at, are these brain networks that we're identifying, what are the cognitive processes they might be involved in? And specifically looking whether they might be involved in moral decision making. So what are the areas of the brain that are normally involved when we are trying to make decisions that affect other people and their well-being? And how do our brain findings in our patients with FTD or lesions relate to that? And so again, initially looking at this in patients with brain lesions, we saw that we looked at whether the lesions causing criminal behavior were connected to this moral decision-making network that had been identified in patients doing fMRI studies where they're actually making moral decisions. These are the brain areas that become active during that task. And then we looked at control lesions that didn't cause criminal behavior. And we asked the question of whether the connections in our patients causing criminal behavior are specifically to brain regions involved in moral decision-making. And that is what we saw here. And so we, at the bottom, in the gray bars, we see that our lesions causing criminal behavior, have a strong connection to areas of the brain involved in moral decision-making. Whereas in the black, those control lesions, we don't see that pattern. And so it seemed to suggest that one reason why brain lesions in these areas and this network associated with criminal behavior may be important is because of the role that those brain areas may play in moral decision-making or decision-making more broadly. Now, again, turning back to the question of the legal implications, one question is, how does this relate to the individual's mental state when they committed the crime or did an antisocial behavior? Because that can have important implications for the legal system. And so I think what we're trying to do in this type of work is figure out what's the mechanism by which these brain diseases might lead to impairments in a specific process. And I think this work, is moving towards that direction. But it's a different question to say that a patient actually has alterations in those capacities, in itself. So you can't tell that just from the brain imaging. That requires testing patients for these various functions that they may or may not have impairments with. And then the ultimate question in the legal realm of whether they therefore have diminished criminal responsibility or other aspects, that requires an extra layer of evaluation that we'll hopefully touch on near the end of the talk. And so to bring this work back to bvFTD, so what are the implications here for patients with bvFTD? I think what we see is that this network that's involved in lesions causing criminal behavior that we see at the top really matches up with the areas of the brain that we see affected in FTD. And so these are just a handful of early studies to make the point. There's many others that show very similar findings, that the brain regions are affected in bvFTD, whether we look at structural brain MRI or functional brain imaging using FDG PET, overlap with the areas of brain that we see they're associated with lesion-induced criminal behavior. So it lends credence to the idea that this disease, through the alterations happening in these brain regions, may lead to the behaviors we're seeing. And similarly, we see that there's an overlap between the brain regions involved in moral cognition in bvFTD. This is a study from Matthias Schroeder in Germany, where he looked at this and showed that on both functional and structural imaging in FTD, there's an overlap with this moral cognition network that's identified when we look at brain activation in healthy subjects. So, combined, this seems to suggest that there's an overlap in the brain regions and a convergence in the regions involved in moral cognition and decision-making, in criminal behavior, in lesion patients, and in bvFTD, suggesting potential mechanisms leading to that. As we move towards FTD and the criminal behavior that comes up, the question becomes, more specifically, what are the deficits or problems that we see in bvFTD that may predispose or lead to antisocial or criminal behavior? And there's a number of different areas where that might be the case. Patients with FTD, as we discussed earlier, have executive function problems. They have problems with response inhibition, with reasoning, with cognitive control. And those all might be things that are important for regulating our behavior in social contexts and could lead to an increased incidence of criminal behavior. There's also changes to social perception and cognition. Now, these are more difficult to measure. They're not obtained in every neuropsychological battery or bedside testing. And so sometimes these changes might be missed, but they're really, we're finding more and more, a hallmark feature of bvFTD. And that includes changes to theory of mind or perspective taking. So this is understanding what somebody else is thinking, or feeling in the moment. And we often regulate our behavior based on that feedback. So if we're getting feedback from a patient that they may, or another individual that they may be thinking of something, that they may find a behavior inappropriate, if we're not picking up on that, we may not modify our behavior, and that can lead to issues. Empathy, or just that understanding the emotions of other people, that others are in pain or distress, that can lead to problems. Recognizing those emotions themselves can be an issue. And then what's referred to as social semantics, of kind of recognizing the social situation, the context. And that ties into that social knowledge at the bottom of, the rules in many social situations are context dependent, that a behavior in one situation may not be appropriate in another. And it really requires recognizing that situation, that context, to act in the right way. There could also be more broad changes to decision-making. So we talked about moral decision-making. There have been a handful of studies in patients with bvFTD showing that they may have differences to the types of moral decisions that they make, whether that's norms against harm, unfairness, or behaviors that would seem indecent or disgusting, that they may have differences in how they view those things. And it may relate more broadly to value-based decision-making. So how we make decisions about things that are going to be rewarding, how we deal with the the idea that there could be negative consequences as well, and how those influence our decision making, even outside of the social context. Those all might be very important for why a patient with bvFTD would develop one of these behaviors. And so which of these is actually linked to antisocial or criminal behavior in FTD? There's hasn't been enough work in this. It's something we're working to look at, but there are at least a few preliminary results. And one that that we had seen, again, goes to that distinction between aggressive and rule-breaking behaviors, and that they may relate to different social emotional deficits or differences that we see in patients with bvFTD. And so we saw here that aggressive behaviors had an association with impairments in empathic concern, although not with perspective taking, whereas the opposite was true with rule breaking or non-aggressive behaviors, where those seem to have an association with perspective taking or theory of mind. And so it again suggests that we may want to take this into consideration, and that there may be differences even within the realm of antisocial or criminal behavior that are important, with different mechanisms and different approaches to thinking about those treatments. And so the final area that I wanted to cover in the talk today is what I refer to here as forensic neurology. So what do we do when we have FTD patients or patients with FTD that are interacting with the legal system? And so what is the challenge there? What is the process, and what are the considerations? And this is a challenge that's being faced not only for FTD, but more broadly within the criminal justice system, where neurological diseases and evidence to support or refute that are being introduced at an increasing amount. So you can see that in the last decade, over 2,800 cases have introduced this type of evidence. And the challenge with that process is that the courts are faced with asking the question of whether a neurological disease is present and contributing, but many of the experts that are evaluating or trying to answer this question may not have training in neurology or the types of diseases that would lead to this evidence being used. So in many contexts, it may be a forensic psychiatrist who is doing this evaluation, who has a large amount of training in the legal issues themselves. So training around criminal responsibility, around competency to stand trial, but maybe less familiar with the neurological diagnoses like bvFTD. It may not be on their radar, and they may have not had experience evaluating patients, knowing how to make that diagnosis, the differences in the symptoms that may be present there compared to other primary psychiatric diseases, or the diagnostic testing that is used. And in other instances, they may call on a research scientist about a specific diagnostic test, but without a clinical evaluation to say, how does this brain imaging finding, for instance, link back to the defendant or to the potential disease? And so, there's a gap there. And, the question or the challenge is, why don't neurologists participate more in this? And I think it's twofold. One is the lack of awareness among lawyers, judges, other forensic mental health experts about the need for this expertise, or that, that it would be important to get and evaluate for people who have experience looking at frontal lobe disorders and functions, and how to order and interpret neurological tests, or how to make the diagnosis in an accurate way. I think there's also a lack of experience and comfort among neurologists. We're not trained in the forensic issues that come up. We're not used to being involved with lawyers, testifying and having questions raised of us in that setting, and it can feel uncomfortable. So I think a lot of neurologists are hesitant because of that lack of awareness to become involved in these types of cases. And so what is the role of a neurologist in a forensic evaluation where there's a question of whether a disease like bvFTD or another neurological disease could be present? So I think the first role is really the diagnostic question. So what is the neurological diagnosis, or is there not one that meets criteria for a neurological diagnosis? Because I think oftentimes that's a starting point. And as we touched on earlier, 14% of our patients with bvFTD may have an antisocial behavior or a criminal behavior as part of their presenting symptom. And so I think it's important to consider that patients may present within the criminal justice system without a clear and accurate diagnosis, or the existing medical records may be unclear. The second question that comes up is, with this diagnosis, what are the resulting behavioral, neuropsychiatric, cognitive issues, and how might those relate to criminal behavior? And so that's where, we can see in our patients with bvFTD, many of those issues around executive function, social cognition, judgment and decision making, known problems with social behavior control and social emotional processing, that all might be important for trying to delve into why, in this specific individual, this specific behavior may have occurred. And then there's the ultimate, or the final question within the legal system, which is the forensic question. And so how do these changes, this diagnosis, the resulting problems that are associated with that, how does that translate into the legal question? And so it's a translation process of saying, do these changes meet the legal definitions or criteria for specific determinations? And kind of how do we make that translation in an effective way that we can communicate it to judges or to juries, forced with making those ultimate determinations. And so I'm going to touch on a few of the areas related to patients with FTD who may present in the legal system, and some of the issues that may be raised in a patient with bvFTD. One is the question of the criteria for criminal insanity. And so there are various different legal jurisdictions, states, federal, and many of them have different specific laws around criminal insanity, but there's many of them share these two kind of prongs that we'll talk about here. One is the appreciation or knowledge of the wrongfulness of the behavior. And so, does the defendant lack that appreciation or the knowledge that what they did was wrong? And I think as we think about our patients with bvFTD, around knowledge itself, when you ask many of these patients, is it wrong to steal? Is it wrong to, hit another person? Many of them can say that that is wrong. So they, can at least say that that is a wrongful or an illegal behavior. But I think the broader context of appreciation, it's unclear if they fully appreciate the wrongfulness, and whether that, is something that can influence their behavior and their decisions, because oftentimes they don't seem to really understand those potential consequences, even if they can list them. They don't seem concerned about them. And there are other types of issues that we see in our patients that maybe suggest that they don't fully understand or have knowledge of that. Something that we see in some of our patients are what we call over-adherence errors, where they extend rules outside of the appropriate context, in a sense that they maybe don't fully understand it. So an example would be spitting. So spitting on another person is wrong, and they can say that, but they might extend that to a situation where it's not wrong, where it's okay to spit after we've brushed our teeth. And so not knowing that the actions are appropriate in one context and not the other can go both ways, where they may have problems, and that might be a demonstration of really not fully appreciating the wrongfulness. There are also studies that have shown a diminished sensitivity to the effects of harm, or to the negative consequences of just decisions in general, of being less motivated, or having less of an influence based on negative consequences when making decisions. And so that might also point towards there being a lower appreciation of the true wrongfulness or negative consequences. And that leads into the other prong that's often in many jurisdictions about the ability to conform one's behaviors to the requirement of the law, and to what extent the impulsivity and disinhibition that we see in our patients, provides evidence to support that interpretation. And so if, the consequences of this type of evaluation would be that if a patient or a defendant were to be found insane, then they are not guilty. So they are not guilty of the crime in question, but there may be an effort to commit them to a medical facility for public safety. So that would lead to questions of, the dangerousness to themselves or to others around them, and kind of what the best environment for preventing that would be. even if a patient doesn't meet criteria for criminal insanity, they may have met criteria for a diminished responsibility argument. And this really is based on the idea in the law that for some crimes, there's a prerequisite mental state or the mens rea that has to be present for that crime to be guilty of that crime. And so an example of that distinction is between first-degree murder versus second-degree murder or manslaughter. And it's really the intention and planning to commit the crime versus more of a reckless commission of that crime. And so we could see an evaluation of a patient with bvFTD where they may have deficits in their various executive and social emotional processing that would make it such that they wouldn't meet the threshold for being able to have that type of mental state. That would lead to them not being guilty of the more severe crime. However, they could be charged with that lesser crime, if there's a lower threshold to what that mental state needs to be. Even in the case where patients, do not meet that threshold, the presence of a neurological disease like bvFTD can still play a role in the sentencing. And so it may be that a patient is still found guilty of a crime, but that the punishment for that crime might be different, as there's often a wide range of punishments available. And so the presence of a neurological disorder could be considered a mitigating factor for deciding, should they get a more lenient sentence or a stronger sentence based on those symptoms, even if they don't meet that full criteria for criminal responsibility otherwise. And then the final area where these issues can interact with the legal system is competency to stand trial. And so when charged with a criminal case, we have to show that a defendant is competent to stand trial, that they can participate in their own defense. And if they cannot, then we do not go forward with that criminal charge because they aren't competent to address and to try and defend themselves. And so again, this has legal precedent for what that kind of gets translated into. And the two prongs that are most commonly used, one is understanding the nature and the consequences of the legal proceedings. And so can the defendant understand the charges? What are they? And what are the consequences of that if they're found guilty? Do they understand who everyone involved in the process is, the judge, the jury, the attorneys? Do they know that they're working with their attorneys and to trust them? Do they know the process for a trial, that evidence is presented through witnesses, that there's the ability to cross-examine, and that they both have the ability and the capacity to testify in their own defense if they would like to, or to consider plea bargains or the different types of outcomes that can happen between guilty, not guilty, or making a plea. And can they assist properly in the defense? So that can they help their attorneys? Are they motivated? Are they trusting? Are they able to work with their attorneys? Can they give them evidence to assist in their defense? And can they make competent decisions around potential plea bargains? And in general, can they conform their behavior in a way that's going to allow them to do well in court? And so all of those things could be taken into consideration when deciding if a patient with bvFTD who has committed a criminal act and is charged with that, if they're even competent to stand trial for that. And so if we go back to turn to our case example of our 48-year-old with these profound behavioral changes, I think the question is, could this process have gone differently? Could we have identified this earlier? And so if we had had that hypothetical brain MRI, if they had had an evaluation with a neurologist, and we saw that this patient's hypothetical MRI looks closer to other individuals with FTD as opposed to a normal brain, would that have changed the outcome? Would we have thought about those criminal proceedings differently and how they evolved? If we had done a hypothetical forensic evaluation and saw that the individual had deficits in their social cognition, that there were problems with theory of mind or empathy, if they showed some of the same behavioral reactions to the crime that other patients with bvFTD have expressed, of being aware of some wrongfulness but seeming like the full appreciation wasn't there. And could they even focus when discussing the case with their lawyer? Could they cooperate? And if they're having behavioral issues that disrupt court, are they even competent to begin with? So would this hypothetical evaluation, would this patient have met criteria for criminal insanity? Would they have been not guilty for that reason? Or would they have had diminished responsibility because of the mens rea question? Would they have ended up in prison in a homeless shelter? Or would there have been efforts to have a different type of punishment, even if they were convicted and charged with these crimes? Would they have been sent to a medical facility instead that would have been able to provide better care? And ultimately, was this individual even competent to stand trial in the first place? These are the types of questions that may come up in these contexts. And so I just want to end with a few points for healthcare professionals about, if your patient with FTD is charged with a crime. I think that a first step can be talking with the defense attorney that they have. This is the person advocating for them on behalf of them in the legal system, and explaining to them, what is the diagnosis of bvFTD? This diagnosis may be unfamiliar to many defense attorneys, explaining the association that there is a known association with criminal behavior, that there are these cognitive and behavioral deficits that we see in FTD, and that specifically which deficits you see in your patient, explaining the progressive course and the needs of patients with bvFTD, and offering to write a letter on behalf of the patient to the court. Sometimes a letter will suffice. Other times, you may be called to testify, and that can be intimidating to be in that context, but to consider doing that to explain the disease and how it's manifesting in your patient. And then also if a patient is incarcerated, the lawyer can sometimes be the best person to pass information on to the jail's medical team. I've had instances of a patient incarcerated where, I'm not allowed to talk with the patient. I can't talk with the medical team at the prison. They may not even acknowledge that the patient is incarcerated. They may not be able to talk with friends or family because of the considered security risk, but usually defense attorneys are able to interact in a way that may make this more likely to get pushed forward. And then, in terms of trying to prevent these patients with behavioral issues and FTD from being charged with a crime, it's a real challenge. So I think it's identifying those behaviors that are problematic, trying to prevent those situations from happening or where that would lead to more serious consequences. So, in a patient with sexually inappropriate behaviors, trying to have it so they're not unsupervised in public areas or particularly around children where the consequences of that behavior, like exposing oneself, could be much more significant and lead to much bigger issues. Um, Considering medications, although there's really no medications that target this specifically. So it's working through and trying our best, to find medicines that may help overall. And then providing some type of information that a patient can carry with them, where if they are in one of these instances, can help to point out the issues that may be going on at that moment to try and prevent things from escalating further. The other situation that may come up for some of you is that you're contacted by an attorney about a defendant where a question of whether they have FTD has come up. So not your patient, but another individual charged with a crime. And in this context, I would ask you to consider taking the case if it's something you could potentially be comfortable with. And I think the reason for that is that, for the criminal justice system, without a thorough neurological evaluation, the court cannot accurately determine whether the patient may or may not have FTD or another type of neurological disease. That really requires participation on the part of experts who can try and do that evaluation and explain it in a clear way to those that have to make these decisions. That having neuroimaging isn't enough, that it can't just be a neuroimaging test, that really that needs to be in the context of a clinical evaluation to relate it to that actual patient and their mental states. And then, to remember that 14% of FTD patients may have committed a crime before they have that diagnosis. That might be an initial presentation. And so there may be these cases that are presenting in this context that, would require our assistance. And, to be honest and objective, that the job of the expert witness, the neurologist or other expert in this case, is not to determine whether someone's guilty or innocent. It's really to provide accurate information about what may be going on in terms of a neurological disease. And so in conclusion, what I've hoped to talk to you about today is that criminal behavior is common in bvFTD. It can be a presenting symptom even before the diagnosis is made, that it likely relates to damage in the frontal and temporal lobes and the associated impairments that may develop across a range of different associations is something that we're trying to look into further in terms of the mechanisms, that there may be understanding that may lead to better approaches to treating and preventing these types of behaviors, but that we may be faced with patients with bvFTD interacting with the criminal justice system and questions of criminal responsibility, mitigation, and competency to stand trial, and that neurologists can become involved in these situations to try and help with that. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to me. I'd be happy to take any questions at this point.
So thank you, Dr. Darby. This is a complicated and complex issue, and you really provided a very broad overview and inspired a lot of really good questions. So in the time that we have, I'm going to try to work through some of those questions. I think you said you might be able to stay a little beyond the hour, like for you, would be 4 p.m. So you're able to stay a little bit beyond the hour that we scheduled the webinar for. So
Yes,
I'll ask the audience members who are able to stay on, and we'll try to work through some of the questions because there was a lot of good information. So I think you already went back to one of the questions that was part of your presentation, which is, did these incidents with police, the criminal behavior, tend to happen pre-diagnosis or post-diagnosis? And you just reiterated the 14% of situations within your research where the criminal incident was actually, I mean, the way I would describe it is what brought about a diagnosis. But of course, we also don't know about people that uh, were imprisoned because of the behavior and never got a diagnosis, right? So that's a complication. So say a little bit more about that in a nutshell.
yeah, no, I think that that's an unknown. I think you're right that we know that some of our patients that's a presenting reason for their evaluation or diagnosis. But what we're missing from this is how many are the patients that we're missing, like the case example, where they go through this process and never get the diagnosis. And there, I think we don't know the answer to that. Others have pointed out, as well as us, that it may be that in individuals being charged with crimes, over the age of 50 or 55 for the first time, or under the age, or over the age of 50, maybe we should consider FTD or another neurological disease, and should we be screening, criminal defendants or people accused of crimes where they fit that criteria?
Sure, sure. So clearly, there's a lot more research that needs to be done. Unfortunately, we recognize that earlier detection and better diagnostic processes across the country are one of the big challenges that we face in relation to this issue and others. So some other questions. Uh, you spoke in some of your concluding slides about how healthcare professionals can best work with and support families. I want to hone it in maybe on one of the issues that really relates to a common challenge, which is driving infraction and traffic violation. So when you're working and in your center, when you're working with families and a person has an FTD diagnosis, and in particular a bvFTD diagnosis, what do you talk about in relation to driving and driving safety and driving behaviors?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. And the way I frame it with patients and families is that we want to prevent the first problem, the first accident from happening. And so we don't want to wait until that first accident has happened or that first issue has happened, because we want to prevent that from happening. And so we're fairly proactive about having patients consider driving evaluations if the issue is one with executive control or cognitive control. And also, I would tell patients that if that that family members should drive with the patient. And if there's any concerns about judgment, impulsivity, that those are other reasons to consider, um, you know, moving away from driving. And it's, trying to find other ways of having patients and their families continue to do the things that are important for them, but to find other means of getting that transportation. And I think it goes along, with a broader question of, competencies for financial decision making and other aspects where, we want to try and prevent that first problem.
Um, so another thanks for that advice and guidance. I think I'll also just loop back to one of the other things you mentioned in terms of how families might consider being more proactive and prepared. So and even physicians in terms of what they share with, let's say, attorneys. So AFTD, a few times a year, we certainly get calls from either families that are dealing with the situation or healthcare professionals or even attorneys. So we certainly are sometimes a resource to provide clear printed information about, what is FTD, what is bvFTD, and the symptoms. So we can be a resource in that way. We also, on our website, families can access what we call our awareness cards, which is essentially they can either call our helpline and be sent these cards, or they can print them out themselves. But it's a simple card which either a care partner could hand to someone, often used maybe in a restaurant or something like that, but also can be utilized in these situations to explain, what's going on, the neurocognitive nature of the disease and the symptoms, and even cards for people with bvFTD. So you don't need to comment on those specifically, but I wanted to bring them into the mix.
And I think those are exactly the types of things that can be helpful in de-escalating the problems, before they get to that level.
Right, right. Sometimes a care partner may be present when an incident occurs in, let's say, Target, or, where there's a person has taken something essentially called shoplifting by the store, or some other incident where sharing that information in the moment can avoid a more serious incident, but not always, right? So, um, okay, so another difficult topic, the word anosognosia. So one of our attendees brought up that word, and I think it might be helpful. I don't believe you mentioned it. It's not one of the diagnostic criteria at this point, but it does come into play for some people with FTD and bvFTD, and it certainly gets in the way of the person with FTD, responding in appropriate ways potentially to law enforcement. So tell us more about anosognosia, what it is, what it means, and what you can say about it.
Yeah, and so it's really referring to the lack of awareness of the problems going on, problematic behaviors, the deficits, and the diagnosis, and it can be a huge problem. Our patients, I think, for the large part, are not aware that their behaviors are that problematic, are causing that much distress to other people. And I think the other place where that comes in, so I do think that that's likely contributing to the behaviors themselves, but also leads to vulnerability for our patients once they are within the criminal justice system. So if a patient with bvFTD is arrested and incarcerated, they may not tell anyone that they have this diagnosis. When they're doing their medical evaluation, they may not bring it up. They may not advocate for care, and they may be vulnerable in those contexts because of that. And so that also increases the risk or the negative outcomes that could happen.
Um, so I think that another question that's come up, and just would ask you to make any comments you can based upon research. When you talked about diagnosis, you did acknowledge that in some instances, an individual or family might be referred by the physician for a genetic test based on family history, family knowledge, and that a genetic test uh, can then well, say what that would confirm. And then the question also relates to, you didn't talk about research and genetics and FTD, but more about the bvFTD research. Is there anything you could say about research and genetically caused FTD and this kind of behavior?
Yeah, that those are good questions. So, with the genetic testing, if someone is presenting with the features of bvFTD and they have that genetic test that is positive, I think that's the strongest evidence to say that the behaviors are the result of this disease. I think that the question though about, are any of these behaviors happening in persons with a genetic risk or a known genetic status? I'm not aware of research specifically in the genetic forms to say, are there differences there? There's some research looking into different types of pathology, which may relate to those genes. I'm not aware of, anything that's looked specifically at genetic carriers and criminal behavior.
Okay. Um, I think one of our clinicians, going back to making a definitive diagnosis, um, a, a possible diagnosis, and then, or a probable well, you go over the two areas. I think the clinician was saying something like the person uh, would be confirmed for three of the six criteria, but there's not a clear brain scan or atrophy shown. Um, what happens in that instance? Is there anything the clinician should pursue, or what kind of statements would they make to the person and or the family member about the meaning of that? And I do know that sometimes, like radiologists who are often pulled in to look at scans, may or may not have the fine expertise, let's say, of a behavioral or an FTD specialist. You can correct me if I've gone out on a limb there.
No, no, I think that's right. It's really challenging. So I think, that the imaging really helps to support that diagnosis is the way I think of it. It increases our confidence towards that. And if the initial, radiology reads are unclear or aren't detecting those changes in someone that you feel like has that, I think one is to either look at the images or have someone with expertise in FTD evaluate those images to look for those, more specific or subtle changes that might be missed. There is also the opportunity to get quantitative neuroimaging. So this is where they check the size of a brain area compared to a group of normal subjects, and they can say, well, the frontal lobe in this patient is in the first percentile. So we think that that is showing quantitatively that there's a change. You can do that with MRI and with PET scans. So that can also help to support that. And then in patients clinically where I still suspect that they have a diagnosis of FTD, I may repeat the imaging in a year because things that weren't clear on the first evaluation may be more clear later. If there is, though, there are patients where they don't have those brain imaging changes that are obvious in these ways to detect it, but we may still feel like they have FTD. I think that that opinion can still be given if they get into trouble with the law, but it would have less confidence around it because of the lack of the supporting imaging features. So that may be, something where there's just less evidence to help support it, but there may be other evidence, from neuropsychological testing to support it in a different way.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we're going to have to close. So, one of our attendees asked, um, in the Alzheimer's world, I know like safe return, medic alert, and also sometimes family members are encouraged to have contact with their local police department, um, to talk to, let's say, a community policing officer, or sometimes departments have a police officer that focuses on elder care or specific health issues. Is that a a blanket recommendation you make to families, or is it something where it depends on their locality and their police department? How does your center respond to that kind of issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that being proactive about it before an incident has happened, will help in the long run. And so those resources may be differently available in different communities, and different policing departments may or may not have the resources for that. But I think, making that proactive attempt, sometimes it's also talking with neighbors, or if there's a school nearby, or other places where these behaviors might lead to issues. If there's a store nearby that a patient frequents, to try and prevent the escalation of a behavior leading to a criminal charge, where, once it goes down that road, it can be harder to come back. So I do think that, being proactive is helpful, but it does depend to some extent on what is available in that community.
Right. And situation to situation, I suppose, in terms of the behaviors that both the clinician and the family members are observing.
Yeah.
So we are going to have to pull this to a close. Thank you so much for covering this topic for us, and I'm sure we'll be following up with additional materials to our attendees. So I'm going to cover a few other things as we close, and again, thank you for being brave and really giving us a clear and wonderful overview of this issue.
Well, thank you, everyone.
I want to share that AFTD, is very interested to make sure that all of you are aware of the kind of research that is taking place in the FTD space, as well as currently recruiting active research opportunities. You should know that AFTD's next webinar, AFTD and You, Partners in Drug Development, will be taking place on March 21st. It's a joint presentation between AFTD and our partner, the FTD Disorders Registry, and you can check on our website. I don't believe that's posted yet, but it will be shortly, and you can learn more about that. The FTD Registry is a powerful tool in the movement to discover treatments and a cure for FTD. Individuals with firsthand experience, persons with an FTD diagnosis, their care partners, family members, and friends are encouraged to sign up at the registry to share their lived experience and to learn about research. Healthcare professionals are also able to sign up at the registry to have access to research information. This concludes our webinar. We thank you for joining us today. To remind you, tomorrow everyone will get our CME CEC submission email. If you do not get it, check your spam box first and then reach out to us. We also will be following up to all of you with additional resource materials, including some articles written by Dr. Darby. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.